Well, thank you very much for the invitation here this evening. As you see, the title of the talk is Ireland in 1922, 100 years ago. In fact, last week, uh, it's 100 years last week since the Lloyd George government fell and was replaced after a hiatus in the Conservative Party, believe it or not. So things turn around. I was struck by something Kevin O'Higgins said and actually wrote in 1924. O'Higgins was murdered in July 1927, but he was a key minister in the first Free State government. In fact, the key minister in the first Free State government. But he said he had known 4 British prime ministers in a very short time. So again, history has repeated itself 100 years later. But 1922 began with really high drama in Dáil Éireann. The vote took place on the 7th of January, the vote on the treaty. Now, the treaty had been debated in the Dáil for more than 2 weeks. There had been a recess for Christmas. But when the vote was taken on the 7th of January 1922, 64 were in favour of the treaty, 57 against. So a 7 of a difference, a slight majority in favour of the treaty, which came as a surprise to many. A lot of TDs, it appears, had their ears bent during the Christmas holidays by their constituents, if you like, and many of those were in favour of the treaty, just wanted a return to peace, normality, the treaty. And the first image, Jonathan, is of these 2 men, Arthur and Mick. It's a photograph of Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith. These were the 2 men who had really negotiated the treaty in London on behalf of the Irish, the Sinn Féin delegation. That's the treaty, of course, that conferred dominion status on the Irish Free State and included an oath of allegiance. Now, it was a watered-down oath of allegiance, but nevertheless an oath of allegiance to the king at that time, George V. And these are the 2 men who were key to carrying the treaty in the Dáil. Collins famously, it was in those Dáil debates on the treaty that Collins famously said, you know, this treaty doesn't give us the freedom that every nation aspires to, but nevertheless it gives us the freedom to achieve freedom. Something, of course, that was proven by his nemesis, Eamon de Valera. And the next slide is, in fact, de Valera. He is the foremost opponent of the treaty. Dev famously, of course, did not go to London to lead the Irish delegation. De Valera had been to London for a week in July 1921, just after the truce ending the War of Independence, and he had met Lloyd George off and on over 6 days. And he knew what was available. He knew what was negotiable. More importantly, he knew that a republic would not be on the table. There was no prospect of any Irish negotiator coming home with an Irish republic. So he didn't go to London. Now, in his defence, he said that he was better placed at home in Dublin, where he could keep some measure of control over hardliners like Cathal Brugha and Austin Stack, who were in his cabinet. But now, after the treaty vote, de Valera attacked his colleagues Arthur Griffith and Michael Collins, accusing them of betraying the 1916 leaders. Yet Dev, of course, was not advocating a republic. In his famous document number 2, his alternative to the treaty, de Valera had proposed something called external association, which is actually what Ireland developed with the 1937 constitution. It's actually what India gained in 1947, which was in effect, a republic associated with the Commonwealth. That's what he was proposing in 1922, but it was probably a generation too early. And the next image is of the Prime Minister at the time, David Lloyd George, a Liberal, leading a coalition government dominated by Conservatives. Now, the treaty had been a triumph for Lloyd George and his negotiating skill. He had led the British delegation during the treaty negotiations. Lloyd George is a man, of course, with a towering reputation. Pre-war chancellor, old age pensions, what we now call unemployment insurance. This is all delivered by Lloyd George before the war. In 1916, he becomes Prime Minister, still wartime Minister of Munitions. He's the politician, rather like Churchill in the Second World War. He's the politician most associated with the Allied victory in the First World War, and subsequently at Versailles, etc. But Ireland had been a stain on his reputation. The War of Independence had drained, if you like, Lloyd George's reputation as a liberal statesman, and the treaty had stopped that. So the vote in the Dáil was something that he obviously welcomed, and he welcomed at a time when his coalition government, as I alluded to at the start, was starting to fall apart and would fall apart 9 months later. But he had led the British team during the treaty negotiations. He had persuaded the Irish to accept Dominion status with a watered-down oath. And he had also conceded to the Irish control, for example, of customs duties. He granted them a boundary commission, and he had agreed that there would be a very prompt withdrawal of British forces from Ireland, and that's actually what happened. And the next image is of another member of the British negotiating team, Winston Churchill, who in 1922 was actually Secretary of State for the colonies. So he is directly responsible for Anglo-Irish affairs. And London, he's the man who is handling relations with Collins and the provisional government, especially on the implementation of the treaty. Now, he's frequently frustrated by what he sees as the Dublin government's kind of reluctance to follow through with the things they had agreed in the treaty. Sometimes he believed, Sinn Féin were attempting to renege on key aspects of the treaty. But for once in his political career, Churchill shows great patience in that period from January to June 1922. And he's much more forgiving and understanding than he normally would be. He's also, of course, very concerned by the upsurge of violence in the North. I mean, the North partition comes in 1921, but it's really cemented in 1922. But first half of 1922, the violence reaches a new peak in the North, and this puts the spotlight on James Craig. No doubt, and especially in this part of the world, tension was inflamed by the Boundary Commission, and Craig, as the Premier, had to deal with that. And here he is, Unionist leader, succeeding Carson in February 1921. Carson made it plain then he didn't want to be the first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. So that fell to Craig. He was he hadn't applied for the job, but out of a sense of responsibility, he came home from London, where he was a junior minister in the coalition government, and he becomes Unionist leader, and he's the man who led the Unionist Party in the May 1921 election, where they, of course, had this huge victory. Now, the image of Craig, solid Ulsterman, but also, of course, a kind of backwoods man, an unimaginative creature as leader of Union. But the reality, I think, is he's a he was charming. It could be a very charming individual, and someone who was undoubtedly courageous. Someone, for example, who went to Dublin on the 5th of May 1921, when the War of Independence was at its worst, to meet secretly meet De Valera, and he got awful flack for that from his unionist backbenchers. So personally courageous, always ready to meet Collins, and we see that in 1922. And someone who was one unionist leader, at least, who was prepared to consider the possibility of Ireland being united at some point during his lifetime. But he faces huge problems at the beginning of 1922. You know, the IRA campaign to destabilize the new state is really underway, backed, of course, by Collins at that time, half secretly. But I mean, Craig and his cabinet were under no illusions about Collins's role in this. Collins, of course, viewed IRA activity in the North as a way to keep the organization united when it was threatening to tear itself apart over the treaty. But one of Craig's fears, big fears at the time, wasn't just about the external and internal threat from armed republicanism. It was that he would be abandoned by the British government. Those fears had been, I think, heightened during the treaty negotiations when he came under huge pressure to bend on recognition of an all-Ireland Parliament. And there's evidence, now this isn't for another day, but there's evidence that Craig was willing to agree to that. Meets Bonner Law, the Tory, senior Tory figure from here originally, of course. And Bonner Law said, no, you don't go back on that. Sit on your Ulster rock. And of course, Craig ultimately did that and did it with some gusto. But during the treaty negotiations, the Tory press had been very hostile towards Craig. One thing they weren't going to stand for, the Conservatives at that time, was what they would have considered was just Ulster intractable and not willing to bend at all, not willing to compromise at all. And Craig had been very frustrated by that and angered by that. Now he was facing huge pressure, I think, to give ground from the Lloyd George government on the treaty. This is the Article 12 of the treaty. This is what really, I think, put Craig in a difficult position, the Boundary Commission Clause. Because when you read that, as unionists, they saw that as a threat, particularly unionists in Tyrone and Fermanagh, because this threatened the territorial integrity of the 6 counties, no doubt about it. And there was widespread speculation in the unionist press that, you know, Tyrone and Fermanagh could be lost. So this is a problem for Craig, that they were going to lose parts of the Northern Territory. That's certainly what Collins and Griffith thought. I mean, Tyrone, Fermanagh, Collins said Tyrone, Fermanagh, Derry City, Newry, parts of South Armagh would be transferred, and what would be left would be economically unviable. That's the way Collins was thinking. And the next slide here, this is a heading in the newsletter, and this is on the 8th of February 1922. The 60 is a bit of an exaggeration. There are actually 42, but unionist fears are really now at fever pitch, because on the night of the 7th, 8th of February 1922, prominent unionist figures were seized by the IRA, which came across an action organised by Owen O'Duffy in the south, who actually became the first Garda commissioner. But they came across, they seized these prominent, excuse me, I must get this water. They seized these prominent unionist figures and they took them back across the border. Now, The story here is what actually happened. This is a reaction by O'Duffy to events in January. On the 14th of January, a group of Monaghan footballers were arrested in Dromore. They were on their way to Derry to play a challenge match. Now, that was cover for, they were going to try and spring 3 Republican prisoners from Derry jail where they were awaiting execution. Their number included Dan Hogan, who was leading he was a railway clerk in Clonus. He's the brother of Michael Hogan, the famous, so he's from Tipperary, the brother of the famous Michael Hogan, who was killed. He's the player who was killed on Bloody Sunday at Croke Park. But they were arrested in Dromore by B specials who found documents on them indicating what their real intent was. O'Duffy planned this here to force their release. But the reaction here, of course, it terrifies border unionists who are hysterical, demanding from Craig action. And they were saying things, you know, you must send a force of 5,000 specials across the border and bring our people back. Craig's fiercest critics, actually, were 2 people from Fermanagh and Tyrone, James Cooper from Enniskillen and William Coote. Now, Coote is from Ballygawley, there. Businessman and one of Craig's absolute fiercest opponent. He actually, in Union Theological College, where they had the first Northern Ireland Parliament, this is 10 years before Stormont's built, he sat on the opposition benches, and he and Cooper frequently tore into Craig. He was too soft, Craig. And the next slide is actually Coote, hard-line unionist MP for Fermanagh. So he's a businessman here in Ballygawley. Actually, his son was one of those kidnapped. Cooper actually would have been kidnapped, only he fired his weapon from an upstairs window and managed to chase off the attackers. So these are people who, I suppose, felt this pressure acutely. Coote's son, as I say, was one of those who was taken away. And they heaped pressure on Craig, you know, for his failure to defend the loyalist people in Fermanagh and Tyrone, as they put it. They were also the leading advocates of abolishing PR in local elections, and something that would follow, of course, in 1922. And I'll mention something about that later. But all of this means kind of increased tension along the border. That 7th, 8th of February we're talking about, Craig responds by sending specials, more specials to Fermanagh and Tyrone. And on the Saturday, the 11th of February, 19 leave Newtownards, the depot, into Belfast, and they go from Belfast to Enniskillen. Now, in those days, the railway line ran from Belfast to Clonus. You changed trains in Clonus and then on to Enniskillen. These 19 uniformed specials, 6 of whom were armed, were spotted waiting 25 minutes on the platform in Clonus. The local IRA commander, Matt Fitzpatrick, got word of this, and he immediately raced to the station with IRA volunteers. And what happened subsequently is disputed, but Fitzpatrick was killed, but 4 of the specials were killed. I've read the testimony from John McGonnell, who was one of the volunteers. He had the Thompson submachine gun and wrecked the 3 carriages. But when the train came into Lisbon, it was terror. When it reached Enniskillen, you know, this was hyped. If you can need to hype these things up. But again, terror, fear was the order of the day. But interestingly, what it does, of course, is it provokes a violent backlash in Belfast, not along the border here, but in Belfast. And the next slide, this is the reference here to the McMahon killings, terrible tragedy in Belfast. This is the most serious of these outrages, which comes in March 1922. The McMahon home, Sunday evening, Kinnaird Street, just off the Antrim Road, big house. Owen McMahon, 4 of his sons, and an employee who lodged with him. The 6 of them were killed. He's a prominent figure in Belfast, in the licensed trade in Belfast. But the aim is clearly to spread terror among the Catholic community in Belfast. And the murders provoke widespread revulsion in Britain. Craig himself offered a £1,000 reward for information leading to the conviction of the perpetrators. But Collins seizes on the murders and to really hammer Craig. He's not able or willing to protect the Catholic community in Belfast. Churchill has to intervene, and he brings the 2 leaders together at the Colonial Office in London. This is famously the second of the Craig-Collins Pacts, where Churchill can't resist a flourish. Pieces today declared ran the headline at the top that he had. The next slide is Joe Devlin. Now, Owen McMahon was a close associate of Joe Devlin. Now, Owen McMahon, they weren't Sinn Féin. They were nationalists and close to Devlin. And Devlin warmly welcomes the pact. You know, he sees this as bringing peace. He also sees it actually as a step towards the future unity of Ireland, as he says. But the upsurge in violence in Belfast that follows in April and May just kills any prospect of the pact holding. Collins had made a mistake by excluding this man. Devlin was someone who was highly regarded by Churchill. Churchill had known him for 10 years more and thought of him as a brilliant parliamentarian. And he was hugely respected by Craig. The 2 men had mutual respect for each other. But Collins excludes Devlin from all his deliberations as far as the North's concerned. Makes sure he's sidelined. He only wants to deal with Sinn Féin people, but a lot of the Sinn Féin people that they're using here, they're not from the North. They're people like Sean Milroy from the South. So Collins, the truth is, he's more concerned about his professional government in the South at the time than he is at the North. He wanted to contest the 1921 elections. He wanted Sinn Féin to do it. He himself was elected, actually, for the first Belfast Parliament. He backs the Belfast boycott, which in many ways is counterproductive. And then he subsequently agrees with Craig that, you know, together they can sort out the border. So one of the things that I think historians now would agree on is that, you know, much of what Collins does is there's no kind of coherence to his policy. As far as the North's concerned, he's obviously someone who's very quick to make decisions and someone who's not afraid to take risks. The next slide is evidence of this. This refers to, you'll all know about this here. This is the invasion of the Ballycpettigo Triangle, where about 100 volunteers cross the border. There's no bridge at Bow Island at this doesn't come to the early 1930s. So by occupying that piece of land along Lough Erne, they hold that piece of territory. Now, the Unionists in Fermanagh are, again, they're terrified. Collins backs this. This is a joint IRA offensive, pro-treaty and anti-treaty. He saw this as a way of keeping together the warring factions at the time, or about to become warring factions, and the IRA. But as I said, Craig is again hammered by unionists, particularly border unionists, who say you can't protect us. Our territory has now been invaded. Basil Brooke, leader of the specials in Fermanagh, he immediately tries to dislodge them with no success. They had 3 Crossley tenders damaged, and much to their embarrassment, they lost a Lancia armoured car, which was seized by the IRA in an engagement. So they weren't going to be able to dislodge this force in Balleek Fort and in Pettigo. Craig pleads with Churchill for assistance, and Churchill does nothing. For 4 days, he does nothing. Seeing how things are going to pan out, he doesn't want to react too quickly. After 4 days, he sends on the army. First day, the army there, they don't dislodge them, but the next day they use artillery, and the territory is retaken. In fact, the army stay in Pettigo until 1924 afterwards. But Craig, as you can imagine, has come under fire for failing again to protect the Unionist community in Fermanagh. So by the end of June 1922, what I think is, you've all heard this siege mentality of the Unionist population. That's at its peak in the summer of 1922, but it's suddenly that pressure's released with the beginning of the Civil War at the end of June 1922. And that's the Civil War. Rory O'Connor, very prominent Republican figure who refused to accept the treaty. On the 14th of April 1922, O'Connor and his men occupy the forecourts on the Liffey there in the middle of Dublin. And they establish an army executive in opposition to the provisional government. Now, this puts Churchill up the walls, because what does Collins and the provisional government do about it? Nothing. And in spite of Churchill urging them to take action, they don't do anything about it. So they've established this military headquarters, anti-treaty IRA headquarters in the middle of Dublin. It's one of the, I think, defining moments on the road to civil war in the South, because O'Connor cannot be negotiated with. Any compromise on the Republic for O'Connor is a compromise he's not willing to accept. Now, there are other causes of the Civil War. I mean, there's still land hunger in the parts of the West. There was what the late Michael Hopkinson has famously described as general lawlessness in parts of the South and West, and what he calls local particularism. Communities in the South and West who wouldn't accept Dublin's authority on anything. Rebel Cork has always had a thing about Dublin, and it's still got it 100 years later. But this was very obvious at the time. But after the treaty vote in the Dáil, most of the general headquarters staff stayed loyal to Collins, but an awful lot of the more senior officers in Munster were anti-treaty. So what happens subsequently, you've got the elections to the third Dáil, which take place on the 16th of June, 1922, and they demonstrate a clear majority in favour of the treaty. Okay, not with any enthusiasm, but there's a clear majority in favour of the treaty. And important elements like the Catholic Church, like big business, like the big farmers, and many people who were war weary from the War of Independence, they want a return to normality and peace. And then comes Wilson's assassination on the 22nd of June. Field Marshal Henry Wilson, just retired as Chief of Imperial General Staff, is gunned down outside his home, returning in London, from opening a war memorial in London. Now, Churchill and the government immediately point the finger at Rory O'Connor and the Four Courts executive in Dublin, blaming them. It's more than likely that this was an order issued by Collins some time before. It's quite interesting. The two men who carried out the attack are actually both ex-British Army. They both fought in the First World War in the British Army, but they were IRB men, and they're London. They're from over there. One of them actually had been wounded, and one of them had a wooden leg. I mean, he'd lost a leg in the First World War, which made, escape from the scene problematic, and they were quickly captured. They were subsequently hanged. But the point is that Wilson has been military advisor to Craig after he resigned as Chief of Imperial General Staff. Now, you might think Wilson and Craig, therefore, are like that. They're not. Wilson had little time for politicians. He despised Lloyd George. He didn't think a great deal of Craig. He thought the Minister of Home Affairs here was an absolute small man in every way, as he described him. He didn't think the specials he thought they were counterproductive. He thought this was a job for the army, not the police, etc., etc. But his assassination leads directly to the Civil War, because Churchill has to confront Collins, and he says, look, Four Courts, you either deal with those people or I will. And Collins desperately did not want the British to come back because that would, put the whole thing up in the air, something he was desperately keen to avoid. So 28th of June, 3:40 a.m., the 18-pounders, which the British loaned them, open up on the Four Courts, and the Four Courts are quickly cleared. And this marks the start of the Civil War, the result of which is not in doubt after a month. Craig again here. In the north, as I said, the feeling of that siege is lifted. And that it's all palpable once civil war breaks out. And yet Craig still finds himself hounded by border unionists who want to be protected. He's harried by these Fermanagh and Tyrone unionists in particular. The violence up here peters out quickly. There isn't any after June 1922, very, very little. But this preoccupation with security continues as far as the unionist government's concerned. And Craig bows to unionist pressure from Fermanagh and Tyrone to adjust local government, to abolish PR and redraw the electoral constituencies. James Cooper famously, privately told a unionist colleague, I gerrymandered last night. He was determined to show that Fermanagh was unionist and Coote, the same, Tyrone, was unionist. So they had kept up the pressure. Of course, Craig's big failing, as I see it, is in that second half of 1922, he fails to reach out to the minority community, to the Catholic community here. Civil war means partition is no longer a priority for the Dublin government at all. They've got things, much greater problems closer to home. And of course, Griffith dies from a massive stroke on the 12th of August. 10 days later, Collins is killed at Beal-na-Blah. So things are going to be very different as far as the North's concerned. And there's evidence of that. This is Ernest Blythe, member of the provisional government, Lisburn Protestant, but someone who had a keen understanding of the North. Before the two men actually died on the 9th of August, he'd submitted a major memorandum to the provisional government in the South, urging Dublin to take a much more moderate line as far as unionism is concerned. And he, for a start, he said nationalist MPs should take their seats in the Belfast Parliament. They should abandon abstention. He also said that the previous kind of belligerent policy that Collins had orchestrated as far as the North, that had actually been counterproductive. What we need is going forward is cooperation. And he urged that on his colleagues. And subsequently, the Cosgrave, who succeeds Collins, as the political chief down there, ably assisted by Kevin O'Higgins, but they take a much softer line in the north. Actually, Blythe, in this memorandum, blamed both the Belfast government and the provisional government in Dublin, of which he was a member, for the collapse of the Craig-Collins Pact. But again, as I said, Craig fails to change course in the second half of 1922 when he had the opportunity. Now, one reason for that, I think, is his cabinet colleagues. And here's one of them. Richard Dawson Bates, the Minister of Home Affairs, he'd been secretary of the Ulster Unionist Council since 1905. He'd been with Craig and Carson as a backroom guy during the Ulster crisis and the struggle against Home Rule. He's a bigot. Solicitor from worked and practiced in Belfast. Machraboy House, those of you who know that in Portrush, the Dawson Bates room's still in there. That's where he lived. But he took every opportunity to undermine the Craig-Collins Pact. He never trusted Craig in his dealings with Collins. And the problem was Craig was in London too much. He felt he had to be in London to safeguard Northern Ireland's interests there, the Unionist government's interests there. He was right about that. But while he was away, too much power was left with Mr. Bates, who had got increased security powers. You know, the Royal Ulster Constabulary is formed on the 5th of April, 1922. He's got responsibility for law and order. 2 days later, Special Powers Act is introduced, giving him, as Minister of Home Affairs, you know, considerable powers, huge powers. Craig made a bad choice when he appointed Bates as his Minister of Home Affairs. Yet Craig always defended his ministers. I mean, what he should have done, I mean, he actually said at one point, no one understands the Ulster Unionist mind like Dawson Bates. Bates famously was known to be able to predict not just what way each constituency would go, which way each street in Northern Ireland would vote. But he stays as Minister of Home Affairs to 1943. One of the first things Brooke does when he becomes Prime Minister is he boots him out. He got rid of him. But Bates is one of those boys who viewed all Catholics as potential insurgents at the time. You know, he didn't trust them. He'd got these extra additional powers, the Special Powers Act, which was used totally the wrong way and failed to build any kind of confidence among the minority community. Craig should have sacked him, as I said, but because it was obvious that he was an obstacle to impartial government, and it didn't reflect the views of Craig himself. And yeah, this is the last image here. So it would be wrong to assume that Craig had packed his cabinet with hardliners. One Minister of Education, Lord Londonderry, he's the Mount Stewarts, those people, hugely wealthy, but he's someone who's a minister, but again, like Craig, he's often in England. I only discovered the other day, actually, when Bonner Law became Prime Minister in November 1922, he offered a ministerial position to Lord Londonderry, but Londonderry said, no, I feel my loyalty as to Craig, and I want to remain and do my job as a cabinet minister here. But he's often in England, not for the same reason as Craig. I mean, huge financial rip-up. The Durham coalfields, he owns them. So he's huge wealth, but huge business interests to attend to. Again, someone who was routinely critical of Dawson Bates. He always took and you can see that when you go through the cabinet minutes for that period from 1921 to 25. But he fails to persuade his other colleagues that, you know, we need to change direction as he advocated. Like Craig, as I said, he's too often absent, and he never grasps the importance of the influence of the Orange Order. Now, he is the man who in 1923 gives us an Education Act, which is takes education out of the hands of the churches. But subsequently, he resigns in December 1925, having been forced to backtrack under pressure from the Orange Order and Protestant church leaders. And in December 1925, he gives up and he goes back to England and becomes involved in Tory politics there. He actually becomes a minister, but not until 1932 across the water. But by this point, of course, by 1925, and I'll finish here, Craig has met Cosgrave in London with Stanley Baldwin, the next Prime Minister. These things aren't just happening in 2022, the rapid turnover of personnel in Number 10. Baldwin brings the two men together and they sign a tripartite agreement which recognises the existing border. There's been a terrible hoo-ha about the Boundary Commission. Its reports leaked. Cosgrave needs a way out. Craig seizes the chance. Baldwin's keen to, tick that box and get that off the table. So he brings the two men together and the three of them sign a tripartite agreement which recognises the border. And it's been like that ever since. Thank you very much. Thank you.